There is a moment that happens to almost every person who walks through the arch at Horse Guards Parade in London for the first time. They stop, they look up, and then, without fully understanding why, they go quiet. It is not the buildings that do it. It is not the tourists around them, the noise of the city, or even the immaculate uniforms of the soldiers standing guard. It is the horse. Specifically, it is the way the horse is standing, completely still, completely unbothered, as if the entire world, the cameras, the crowds, the noise, the pigeons, the double-decker buses rumbling past on Whitehall, simply does not exist. Most people take a photo and move on. They assume they are looking at a well-trained animal doing a simple job. They assume the uniform is the impressive part. They assume the soldier is the story. They are wrong on every count. But you cannot really blame them, because unless you know what you are looking at, a drum horse looks like a very large, very handsome horse standing very still. It looks like pageantry. It looks like decoration. It looks like the kind of thing you photograph and forget about by the time you reach the end of the street. James Whitfield thought exactly this. James was a documentary filmmaker, 38 years old, based in Bristol, with 3 well-reviewed films about British military history already to his name. He was not an ignorant man. He was not a careless man. He had done his research, or at least he believed he had. He arrived at Horse Guards Parade on a bright Tuesday morning in October with a crew of 4 people, 2 cameras, a sound recordist, and an absolutely unshakable confidence that he was about to spend 3 days filming what he privately described to his producer as a horse in a fancy hat doing not very much. His producer, a woman named Rachel, had raised an eyebrow at that. "Have you actually read the briefing notes?" she asked him. "I skimmed them," James said. This is a story about what happens when you skim the briefing notes. It is also a story about a horse named Sovereign. And once you understand what Sovereign is, what Sovereign has been through, what Sovereign carries, literally, and in every other sense of that word, you will never walk past Horse Guards Parade the same way again. Because here is the truth that almost nobody knows. The drum horse is not decoration. The drum horse is not a prop. The drum horse is arguably the single most trained, most tested, most carefully selected animal in the entire British Army. And the day James Whitfield arrived with his camera crew and his quiet condescension, Sovereign was about to give him the most thorough education of his professional life. Not through aggression, not through drama, not through any kind of confrontation at all. Through something far more powerful than any of that. Through absolute, unbreakable, magnificent discipline. To understand what happened that Tuesday morning, you first need to understand what a drum horse actually is. And to understand that, you need to go back. Not 10 years, not 50 years, centuries. The Household Cavalry is the oldest and most senior regiment in the British Army. It has existed in its current form since 1661, when King Charles II returned from exile and re-established the monarchy. From the very beginning, the regiment had 2 functions: to protect the sovereign and to represent the crown in ceremonial duties that required absolute precision, absolute discipline, and absolutely no room for error. The drum horse was central to both. In the age before radios, before electronic communication of any kind, the kettle drums carried by the drum horse were how cavalry commanders communicated across a battlefield. The beat of those drums carried orders across distances that no human voice could reach. Charge, halt, retreat, rally. The drum horse was, in the most literal sense, the voice of the regiment. If the drum horse panicked, if the drum horse bolted, if the drum horse failed in any way, the entire regiment could lose the signal it needed at the moment it needed it most. This is why the selection process for a drum horse is unlike the selection process for any other military animal on Earth. The horse must first meet a basic physical standard that eliminates the vast majority of candidates before training even begins. A drum horse must stand at least 16 hands 2 inches tall, That is approximately 5.5 feet at the shoulder, which is large even by the standards of warm bloods and heavy breeds. It must be either a skewbald or a piebald, meaning it carries a coat of two distinct colors in large patches. This is not aesthetic preference. The distinctive coloring makes the drum horse visible across a parade ground, across a crowd, across the kind of distance where detail disappears and only shape and color remain. But the physical requirements are almost the easy part. The drums themselves weigh over 250 pounds. Some of the silver kettle drums carried by the household cavalry are antiques, actual battlefield instruments from campaigns fought centuries ago, presented to the regiment by monarchs as gifts and honors. They are irreplaceable, they are priceless. And they are strapped to either side of a living animal that must carry them through crowds, through noise, through the kind of controlled chaos that a major ceremonial parade generates, without so much as flinching. Because here is the detail that stops most people cold when they hear it for the first time. The drum horse carries the drums and the drummer. The drummer plays the drums during the procession, and because both of the drummer's hands are occupied with playing, the drummer cannot hold the reins. There are no reins in the conventional sense during a performance. The horse is guided entirely by pressure from the rider's legs and feet, subtle shifts of weight, practice signals developed over months and years of training between one specific rider and one specific horse. The horse must know exactly where it is going. It must maintain its position in a formation of other horses, some of which may be nervous or distracted. It must respond to commands it cannot see given by a rider whose hands are literally unavailable. It must do all of this while carrying an enormous amount of weight, while drums are being beaten loudly directly beside its ears, while crowds of thousands of people press in from either side, while cameras flash and children shout, and the noise of central London wraps around everything like a wall of sound. And it must do all of this without showing a single sign of stress. The training for a drum horse takes between 2 and 3 years minimum. The washout rate is extremely high. Many horses that begin the program never complete it, not because they are bad horses, but because the standard is simply that demanding. A horse that is merely very good is not good enough. A horse that performs well 95% of the time is not good enough. The drum horse must perform at 100% on the specific days when performance is required, because those days include the trooping of the colour, the state opening of Parliament, and other occasions where the eyes of the world are watching, and there is no margin for anything less than perfection. Sovereign had been in service for 6 years when James Whitfield arrived with his cameras. He was a 16-3-hand Irish draft cross, skewbald in coloring, great sweeping patches of chestnut, and white across a body that weighed close to 1,200 pounds. He had completed the trooping of the colour 4 times. He had carried his drums through the streets of London in front of crowds exceeding 100,000 people. He had been assessed by the regiment's veterinary team, his handling team, and his designated rider, a corporal of horse named David Marsh, as being in the finest condition of his career. He was, in the quiet and considered opinion of everyone who worked with him daily, exceptional. James Whitfield, who had skimmed the briefing notes, looked at Sovereign on that first morning and said to his cameraman, and this is a direct quote that Rachel would later repeat at some length, "He's bigger than I expected, but horses are horses, aren't they?" Rachel closed her eyes briefly. The stable staff, to their considerable credit, said nothing. The first day of filming was supposed to be simple: background footage, establishing shots, the kind of material that sits under a narrator's voice and gives the viewer a sense of place and atmosphere. James wanted shots of Sovereign being groomed, being tacked up, walking through the yard. Standard documentary material, nothing that required any particular cooperation from the animal beyond existing in the frame. Corporal David Marsh, who had been Sovereign's designated rider and primary handler for 4 of the horse's 6 years in service, gave the crew a quiet briefing before they began. He explained the yard protocols. He explained where the crew could and could not stand. He explained that Sovereign was a calm animal, but that calm did not mean indifferent, and that the horse was aware of everything happening in his environment at all times. He asked that the crew move slowly, avoid sudden movements near the horse's hindquarters, and check with him before repositioning cameras. James nodded in the way that people nod when they are waiting for someone to finish talking. The first hour went smoothly enough. Sovereign stood in the yard with the particular quality of stillness that characterized everything he did, not the frozen stillness of an anxious animal holding itself rigid, but the deep, settled stillness of a creature that was simply completely present in its own body and entirely unbothered by what surrounded it. The cameras rolled. The sound recordist picked up the ambient noise of the yard. James watched through a monitor and made small adjustments to shot composition. Then James decided he wanted a specific shot. He wanted the camera positioned directly in front of Sovereign, low to the ground, angled upward. A dramatic perspective, he explained to his cameraman, something that conveyed scale and power. He described it as the shot that would open the film. David, who was standing nearby, said calmly that he would prefer the camera not be placed on the ground directly in front of the horse. He explained that horses have a blind spot directly in front of their faces at close range, and that a camera appearing suddenly at ground level in that blind spot could startle even the most experienced animal. He suggested an alternative angle, slightly to the side, that would achieve a similar dramatic effect without the risk. James considered this for a moment. Then he told his cameraman to set up the shot, as originally described. David did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He stepped back slightly and watched. The cameraman, a young man named Tom who had been doing this job for less than 2 years, and who was, frankly, a little nervous around horses at the best of times, got down on one knee and began positioning the camera approximately 4 feet in front of Sovereign's nose, angled upward at roughly 30 degrees. Sovereign looked at the camera. Or more precisely, Sovereign looked at the general area where the camera was, because at that distance and angle the camera was sitting in the lower edge of his visual field. His ears moved forward. His nostrils flared slightly, not in alarm, but in the manner of an animal cataloging new information about its environment with the methodical thoroughness of long experience. And then Sovereign did something that nobody on the film crew was expecting. He took one deliberate step forward, lowered his enormous head, and sniffed the camera. Not aggressively, not with any sign of distress or irritation, with pure, calm, systematic curiosity. He examined the camera the way he examined everything that entered his space thoroughly and without drama. His breath fogged slightly in the October air. His lips moved almost imperceptibly. He stood there for approximately 10 seconds, completed his assessment of this new object in his environment, and then raised his head, returned to his original position, and went back to being still. Tom, the cameraman, had not moved during any of this. He had, in fact, stopped breathing for most of it. When Sovereign's head lifted away, Tom exhaled very slowly and looked back at James with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, most of which were not appropriate for a professional work environment. James, to his credit, laughed. It was a genuine laugh, slightly startled. "All right," he said. "All right, he's curious. Fine, let's try the side angle." David said nothing. He gave Sovereign a quiet pat on the neck. Sovereign accepted it with the same dignified composure he applied to everything. But this was only the beginning. The second incident happened the following morning. James had decided overnight that what the documentary needed, what would really make it stand apart from other military history films, was a sequence showing Sovereign responding to the drums. Not a full rehearsal, not a formal performance, just the drums being played in the yard, close to the horse, to demonstrate how the animal had been conditioned to remain calm under that specific kind of stimulus. David agreed that this was possible. He said he would speak to the regiment's senior drummer and arrange for a short demonstration. He said it should take place in the main yard rather than the smaller practice yard, to give the horse adequate space. He specified that the drums should begin quietly and build gradually, following the same pattern used in training, rather than starting at full volume. James said that starting at full volume would be more dramatic for the cameras. David looked at James for a long moment. "I understand what you're looking for," he said, "but I'm going to ask you to trust the process we have. There's a reason the conditioning works the way it does." James said he was sure there was, and that they would do it David's way. And then he quietly told his sound recordist to be ready, because he was going to ask the drummer to play louder once the cameras were rolling and the shot was established. Rachel heard this and said, in a tone of voice that could have stripped paint from a wall, "James." James said, "It'll be fine." The drummer, a soldier named Mark who had worked with Sovereign for 3 years and whose feelings about the film crew were becoming increasingly visible on his face, began the drums at low volume in the main yard. Sovereign's ears went back briefly at the first stroke, then forward, then settled into a neutral position as the familiar sound registered in his memory and was filed under the category of known, safe, and routine. His tail moved once. His weight shifted slightly onto his hindquarters in the relaxed posture that indicated comfort rather than tension. The drums built gradually in volume. Sovereign remained still. The cameras rolled. Tom was getting genuinely good footage. The contrast between the enormous noise of the drums and the absolute unmoving calm of the horse was exactly the kind of visual storytelling that required no narration, no explanation, no editorial intervention of any kind. Then James said, "Mark, can you give us full volume, just for 30 seconds?" Mark looked at David. David looked at Mark. Something passed between them, the kind of communication that develops between people who have worked closely together for years and no longer need words for most of it. Mark increased the volume. Sovereign's ears went sharply back. His nostrils widened. His weight shifted forward onto his front feet in the precise posture that any experienced horseperson would recognize immediately as heightened alertness, transitioning toward potential movement. David stepped smoothly to Sovereign's head. He did not grab the horse. He did not make any sudden movement. He simply placed his hand on Sovereign's neck, in a specific place that 4 years of daily contact had established as a reliable anchor point, and spoke quietly into the horse's ear. Sovereign's ears came forward. His weight settled back. He exhaled once, long and slow. The drums stopped. The yard was completely silent for a moment. Then Sovereign turned his head and looked directly at James Whitfield with an expression that managed, despite the anatomical limitations of a horse's face, to communicate something remarkably close to assessment. James looked back at Sovereign. "Okay," James said, more quietly than he had said anything since arriving. "Okay, I take the point." Rachel did not say anything. She did not need to. The third incident was the one that James would eventually describe in the documentary's final cut as the moment I understood what I was actually making a film about. It happened on the afternoon of the third day, during a formal mounted exercise in the main parade ground. James had been given permission to film from a designated area to one side of the parade ground. The exercise involved 6 horses in formation, moving through a series of patterns at walk, trot, and canter, with Sovereign at the center of the formation carrying the drums, not played during this particular exercise, but mounted and present as part of the standard working configuration. The exercise was going precisely as it was supposed to go. The formation moved with the kind of effortless precision that is only possible after years of practice. Not the practice of individuals, but the practice of a unit that has become something coherent and unified through accumulated shared experience. Then one of the younger horses in the formation, A gray gelding near the back, who had been in the regiment for less than a year, was startled by something in the crowd of observers watching from the opposite side of the parade ground. A child had dropped something metal. The sound was sharp and sudden. The gray gelding shied sideways, breaking his position in the formation, and for a moment his rider was occupied entirely with bringing him back under control. A gap opened in the formation. Sovereign, without any visible signal from David, shifted his pace and angle by a precise and measured degree, filling the space left by the younger horse, maintaining the overall shape of the formation, and giving the gray gelding's rider the additional half-second of stability he needed to reestablish control. The adjustment was so subtle that, if you were not watching Sovereign specifically, you would not have seen it happen. It was not a dramatic rescue. It was not a moment of visible heroism. It was simply a more experienced animal doing what needed to be done with such economy, and calm that the disruption was absorbed before it could become a problem. The formation continued. The exercise completed without further incident. The observers applauded. James lowered his camera. He stood there for a moment in silence. Then he walked across to where David was dismounting and waited until David had handed Sovereign's reins to a waiting groom. "Did you signal him to do that?" James asked. "When the gray went sideways, did you give him a command?" David considered the question. "I shifted my weight," he said. "But honestly, I'm not certain whether I did it before he moved or in response to him moving. After 4 years, the line gets blurry." James looked at Sovereign, who was being led calmly toward the yard, and who showed every sign of having completely forgotten that anything unusual had occurred in the last 45 minutes. "How long did it take to train that?" James asked. "You don't train that," David said. "That's what he is." What James Whitfield witnessed across those 3 days at Horse Guards Parade was not unusual. It was not exceptional in the context of what Sovereign did on a daily basis. What was unusual was that someone was paying close enough attention to see it clearly, and had the honesty to admit that he had arrived without understanding what he was looking at. This is worth examining carefully, because the lessons embedded in what Sovereign demonstrated go well beyond the specific world of military horsemanship. Consider the first incident with the camera. When Sovereign stepped forward and investigated the unfamiliar object placed in front of him, he was not being difficult. He was not being territorial. He was doing precisely what years of training had taught him to do with anything new in his environment. Approach it with controlled curiosity, gather information, assess, and either categorize it as safe or communicate that it was not. He was following protocol. The protocol that looked, to an uninformed observer, like a horse being nosy, was actually an animal executing a trained response pattern with perfect fidelity. The problem was not Sovereign's behavior. The problem was that James did not know enough to recognize trained behavior when he saw it, because trained behavior at this level of refinement does not look like training. It looks like personality. It looks like character. It looks like the horse is simply being a horse. This is one of the most commonly misunderstood things about animals that have been trained to an exceptional standard. The training becomes invisible. The years of conditioning, the thousands of repetitions, the careful progressive exposure to increasingly challenging stimuli, all of it disappears into the animal's natural way of moving through the world. What remains is competence expressed so fluently that it reads as effortlessness. And effortlessness to an inexperienced eye looks simple. It looks easy. It looks like something that just happens. It is the most expensive illusion in the world. The drums incident reveals something different, something about the relationship between Sovereign and David specifically, and about what it means for a human and an animal to develop the kind of trust that functions as a genuine working partnership. When David placed his hand on Sovereign's neck and spoke into his ear, he was not performing a trick. He was not executing a technique he had read about in a manual. He was using 4 years of daily contact, 4 years of consistent handling, 4 years of being the person who showed up every morning and every evening, who knew exactly how this particular animal moved and breathed and carried tension in his body. He was using all of that accumulated knowledge to communicate something that could not be communicated any other way. And Sovereign responded, not because he was obedient in the way that a machine is obedient, but because he trusted the specific person who was speaking to him. He recognized David not as a handler in the abstract, but as this handler, the one whose weight he knew, whose voice he knew, whose hands on his neck meant reliably and consistently that the situation was under control. This kind of trust does not come from training manuals. It comes from showing up, day after day, in all weathers, in all moods, through the routine and the exceptional alike. It is built in the ordinary moments, not the spectacular ones. And it is exactly the kind of thing that cannot be faked, cannot be shortcut, and cannot be manufactured in the 3 days that a documentary crew spends at a facility. But it was the third incident, the formation adjustment, the almost invisible correction that held the structure together when the younger horse broke, that contains the deepest lesson of all. When David said, "You don't train that, that's what he is," he was articulating something that professional trainers in almost every discipline understand but rarely express so precisely. There is a level of competence beyond which skill becomes identity, beyond which what an individual does in a given moment is no longer the product of a decision. It is the expression of what years of development have made them. Sovereign did not decide to correct the formation gap. He did not assess the situation and select the appropriate response from a mental menu of options. He simply acted with the same naturalness with which he breathed, because at 6 years into his career, the correct response to a formation disruption had become as fundamental to his nature as anything could be. This is what genuine expertise looks like, whether we are talking about horses or surgeons or musicians or anyone else who has committed years of disciplined practice to a specific set of skills. The expertise disappears into the person, or in this case, into the horse. What remains visible is not the effort but the result, and the result looks, to the uninitiated, like it was easy. It was not easy. It was just that all of the difficulty had already been paid for, in full, long before the cameras arrived. There is also something important in the way Sovereign responded to James's escalating presumptions throughout those 3 days. The horse never became aggressive. He never became unmanageable. He never gave James the dramatic confrontation that, in retrospect, James's behavior probably warranted. Instead, Sovereign responded to each presumption with the same measured, proportionate response: curiosity to the camera, a shift of attention to the sudden drums, a quiet correction to the formation gap. He was not passive. He was not simply absorbing whatever was directed at him. He was responding, continuously and precisely, in the way that his training and his temperament equipped him to respond. And this response, calm, measured, proportionate, unspectacular, was in every meaningful sense more impressive than any dramatic reaction could have been. A horse that shied from a camera would have been interesting footage. A horse that threatened an intrusive filmmaker would have been viral content. A horse that stood perfectly still while being examined, settled immediately when its trusted handler intervened, and adjusted a military formation without breaking pace. That was something else entirely. That was what 1,200 pounds of disciplined excellence looks like when it is expressing itself in the world. There is an image that James Whitfield used as the opening shot of the documentary he eventually made about Sovereign and the household cavalry drum horses. It is a wide shot, taken from a distance, of horse guards parade in the early morning before the tourists arrive. The parade ground is empty except for one figure, Sovereign, standing at the far end of the ground, completely still, while the city of London moves and shifts and generates its endless noise all around him. The shot holds for almost a minute without cutting. It is the most expensive minute in the film to have filmed. The logistics of getting a camera crew into the parade ground at that hour required considerable negotiation. James fought for it in the editing room when his producer suggested it was too long, too slow. too quiet. That's the point, James said, and for once nobody disagreed with him. He had arrived at Horse Guards Parade believing he was making a film about pageantry, about tradition, about the decorative aspects of an institution that had survived into the modern world more through sentiment than through genuine relevance. He had arrived, if we are being entirely honest, with a filmmaker's condescension toward his subject, the quiet assumption that he understood what he was looking at before he had looked at it. He left making a film about excellence. Not the loud, visible, highlight reel kind of excellence that fills sports documentaries and corporate motivation videos. The other kind. The kind that accumulates in the quiet, unremarkable hours of daily work. The kind that looks from the outside like stillness, like passivity, like simply standing in one place. The kind that only reveals itself fully when something goes wrong, and the thing that has been built over years responds, automatically and correctly, before anyone has had time to panic. Think about what James saw across those 3 days. He saw a horse investigate an unfamiliar object with methodical calm rather than reactive fear. He saw a horse respond to a trusted handler's touch and settle immediately from a moment of heightened alertness. He saw a horse make a precise formation adjustment that preserved the integrity of a military exercise without being commanded to do so. None of these things were dramatic. None of them would have made a highlight reel. All of them were, in the strictest sense, extraordinary, because they represented the complete integration of years of training into an animal's natural way of engaging with the world. And here is the contrast worth sitting with. There are thousands of horses in Britain. There are hundreds of military horses. There are dozens of horses that meet the basic physical requirements to be considered for drum horse selection. But the horses that complete the full training program and enter active service as drum horses can be counted in small numbers at any given time. Not because horses are incapable of reaching that standard, but because reaching that standard requires years of consistent, patient, progressive work, and then years more of active service in which that standard is maintained and deepened through continued practice. Sovereign was not born exceptional. He was made exceptional, the way everything that is truly excellent is made, through time, through repetition, through the daily decision to show up and do the work even when the work is unremarkable, through the accumulation of small competencies into large ones, through the development of trust between a horse and the humans responsible for his training, until that trust became something so solid and so deep that it could hold steady under conditions that would break a lesser relationship. James Whitfield had walked in thinking the uniform was the impressive part. He walked out understanding that the uniform was the least impressive part by a considerable margin. In the final cut of the documentary, there is a moment near the end where James speaks directly to the camera, not in a scripted narration, but in what appears to be a genuinely unscripted reflection on what the 3 days of filming had changed in his understanding. He says, "I came here thinking I was going to make a film about a horse. I ended up making a film about what it means to be really, genuinely good at something. And it turns out those 2 films are the same film." He pauses, then he says, "I should have read the briefing notes." David Marsh, who was standing just off camera when this was recorded, laughed. It was the first time in 3 days that he had laughed at anything James said. Sovereign, standing in the yard behind them, did not look up. He had work to do. He always had work to do. So here is the question this story leaves with you. Before today, before reading this, did you know what a drum horse was? Did you know what it carries, what it endures, what it takes to become what Sovereign became? Or were you like James Whitfield, walking past something extraordinary and seeing only the surface of it, the costume, the pageantry, the decorative shell of a tradition whose substance you had never had occasion to examine? Because if you were, and most people are, and there is no shame in it, then consider what else might be standing quietly in your field of vision right now, doing something exceptional in a way that looks, to the uninformed eye, like simply standing still. True worth does not announce itself. It does not wave at the camera or create drama to prove its own importance. It stands in the parade ground in all weathers, year after year, carrying what needs to be carried, doing what needs to be done, and trusting that eventually, if the observer is patient enough and honest enough, they will stop, look properly, and finally understand what they are actually looking at. Sovereign understood this long before James Whitfield did. The horse, as it turns out, had always been the one with something to teach.